Okay, there was a hand just at the back. I'm not sure it's going up anymore. No, it's not going up. I just want to make sure. And there's a guy in the blue. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, I'm also from the University of Greenwich. I'm a PhD student. There are two things that have been sort of waiting to be addressed. One just came out of what was being said. If we need to interpret data in order to be communicated or represented, then this makes science as artistic as art, because it's an issue of representation. And it's a problem that lays on the interface between the research and what the research means. Otherwise, it seems that the research would be meaningless. So everything happens on this surface that seems to separate the communication and the research, that it would be raw and not meaningful. And this ties in with something that I was thinking before a few minutes ago, which is the issue of the experiment. Experimenting in art and experimenting in science seem to me, not being a scientist by education, a bit different, but there's a prejudice, and this also comes into it. Is experimenting in science described and preset by a set of rules, and is experimenting in art, as for my personal experience, much more flexible? One can, as an artistic practice, one can start with some parameters and then bend them and change them very quickly, because there is no specific aim to be reached.
Yeah, experimentation, art and science.
Well, I'm not sure I heard everything. In fact, I heard very little. But from what I heard, I couldn't agree with you. I don't think that, from what I understood, you were saying that experimentation in art, the parameters can
more
change.
Flexible, whereas experimentation in science is a bit more rigid.
Let's say your experiment doesn't go too well, so you choose another experiment or something. Is that, no. So in what sense are they flexible?
But isn't that true in science as well?
But of course, failure is a way of learning.
Oh, no.
Well, I don't know. I'd like to bring in something else, and I don't know whether this is helpful or not, but the way I see it is that the big difference, because we're now comparing art and science, and we're talking about artists experimenting and scientists experimenting, but what then is the difference? So the way I see it, this is a very simple definition of the difference between art and science. To me, the difference is that scientists observe the world, and they look at it with a view to understanding it, right? The outside. Artists observe the world, and they're constantly relating it back to themselves. That's the way, at least my work is like that, and I think many artists that I've looked at worked like that. In other words, the world is not a separate phenomena. The world is completely and totally linked to yourself. So an artist looking at the world, whatever they're looking at, whether it's a line on a piece of paper or, you know, the way light moves when you're observing it somehow. I mean, I'm not going to give you exact examples, but whatever they're doing, they're always relating it back to themselves. So it's an outer inner. There isn't an inner. So if you like, it's related also to psychology, but not in a necessarily scientific way. It's related to self understanding. In other words, a kind of quest to understand who one is in the world, and where the world is, and where the boundaries are between self and world. So everything you're doing is always connected to this self, this person, this center.
Which
Okay.
then raises the question of utility. That's why.
Well, I think there's a lot of utility in art, as much
But that's
utility
why the question
perhaps
is
as-
raised. You know,
yes,
how useful and who is it useful for?
yes. Well,
Yeah, I think Mark
that's
just
another
wants to
question.
come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to that, I mean, you're trying to say, are there prescribed or defined things in science which we have to stick to, and does art have those things? I think, well, just look, I mean, in art, there are certain, I mean, I think there are certainly in art, I mean, you're trying to represent things which the eye can see, or the senses at some level are sensitive to, which sticks you in a certain wavelength in terms of sound and light, etc. So I think at some level there are some boundaries in art which are, they're fuzzy, but they are defined. Science, I think many scientific theories certainly have very, very defined boundaries or criteria. So Liliane said about the observer and relating art back to the observer, science has absolutely the opposite point of view, that everything should be independent of the observer.
Exactly.
That's Einstein all over, right? And pretty well, I mean, lots of people come up to me with crackpot ideas going, I've now got a new theory which can explain why Elvis is on the moon, why Lady Diana died, etc., etc., and it explains millions of things all together. But ultimately, all those theories have to satisfy two or three things. They have to be independent of the observer, so the great thing of Lorentz invariance, and they have to satisfy another thing called, this beautiful thing called gauge invariance, which basically means that you can't have a theory which depends on something that you can't measure, which sounds sensible and obvious. But those two things are extremely powerful things which underlie almost everything in modern physics, and it makes almost no sense to have any ideas outside of those things which don't immediately respect those things. It may turn out in 50 or 100 years' time that those two ideas are nonsense, but they've held up extremely well over 100 years.
I'm going to ask the panel to make a 30-second statement because we're actually overrun by some time. And I apologise, but we're not going to hear everyone's question, and the debate can continue as we start to move out of the hall, but I think I need to draw this to a close. So just before we finish, I just want to just check with the panellists. There isn't anything else they want to say, a 30-second statement, and then we'll close the evening. Isambard, a comment from you at all?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think in terms of this, you know, what art brings to science, I mean, I think it's very much, you know, things like this, basically. It enables a dialogue to be opened up, and it enables people to question, basically, what goes on in science in a way which they may not otherwise, you know, have access to. So basically, yeah, that's really what I think. I don't think there's that much I can see in terms of primary gain, but I see all sorts of these things in terms of the way in which questions can be made available and accessible to lots and lots of people.
Okay. Liliane, comment from
I'd
you?
like to just say two things about what I think science gains from art that add to the rest. One is communication. Artists are communicators for science. And I think Joseph Campbell wrote about this quite a long time ago, and it's turning out to be true. And the other thing is fun, pleasure. And the scientists I work with keep talking about having fun. We're going to have fun. For me, the fun is very serious, but for him, it's fun.
Okay, thank you. And Marina.
I would just add the question of daring to cross the boundaries and reflecting upon the fact that professionally we are separated. We haven't been separated forever. In fact, the Royal Academy wasn't just the Royal Academy, there was the Royal Institution there as well that then moved away. And since it moved away, artists and scientists weren't able to have sandwiches together during the lunch break, which is basically what we need. We need to be able to talk to each other. So that segregating institutionally, as it's done very much also in schools, you either choose your science A-levels or your art A-levels, that necessarily doesn't really take a very, very difficult observation. That necessarily separates us. And therefore we suffer because of that separation. I think what we're talking about really is the inadequacy of not being able to be united, to be together. And when we are together, and that's the normal state I'm in, I'm lucky enough to be there with Art Act at the University of the Arts and with UCL just behind, I feel fine. You know, I don't have to justify it. And in fact, normally my answer is, why not?
Okay. And John?
Well, I would just repeat that phrase I used earlier. I think aspiration morphing into viability is what interests me.
Thank you. And Mark?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think trying to differentiate strongly between art and science is totally counterproductive. The government is trying to pick off artists and scientists one by one. I think we should unite, get behind each other. We're essentially trying to do the same thing, and we should go forward like that.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, can we thank our panel for this evening's lunch?